In July of 330 BCE, the Macedonian king Alexander finally ended the 7-month siege of Tyre, after brutally crushing the last defenders of the island city. He marched south along the coast, determined to conquer Egypt and secure complete dominance over the eastern Mediterranean. But before reaching the cradle of ancient civilizations, his Greco-Macedonian army had to cross the lands of Palestine. As in Phoenicia, most local cities welcomed Alexander as a liberator. Only one obstacle stood in his way: Gaza, a heavily fortified stronghold perched on a high hill, blocking his route further south. It took Alexander 2 months to break Gaza's stubborn resistance, and its fate soon mirrored that of Tyre. With Gaza conquered, nothing stood between Alexander and Egypt. In his eyes, the subjugation of this distant Persian satrapy carried enormous strategic value. Protected on all sides by deserts and seas, Egypt was a natural fortress, one that could pose serious problems in the future. The Nile Delta was also one of the richest grain regions of the Mediterranean, and Greece depended heavily on Egyptian exports. Faced with the grim examples of Tyre and Gaza, the Egyptians had no intention of resisting the Macedonian advance. At Pelusium, a city on the eastern edge of the Nile Delta, crowds gathered to welcome the Macedonian king. The Persian satrap Mazaces surrendered to Alexander, offering 800 talents of silver and the remaining royal treasury. Accepting these gifts, Alexander marched south to Memphis, Egypt's ancient capital, where the priests greeted him not only as a liberator but proclaimed him pharaoh. In return, he showered them with privileges and generous offerings. Realizing Egypt's immense importance to his growing empire, Alexander sought to establish a permanent power base in the region. To achieve this, he founded a new city in the Nile Delta, naming it after himself, Alexandria. The new city was destined to become the heart of Egypt's trade with the wider Mediterranean world. Ancient sources say Alexander personally oversaw the city's layout, marking the future streets with lines of flower. Birds quickly descended to eat it, a sight that Greek seers interpreted as a favorable omen, a promise of the city's future prosperity. And indeed, in the decades that followed, Alexandria became Egypt's commercial and intellectual center. From there, Alexander journeyed deeper into the desert toward the Siwa oasis to consult the Oracle of Ammon, a sacred site visited by pilgrims from across the Mediterranean. The Greeks also revered the Egyptian god Ammon, identifying him with Zeus. Ammon. After following the coastline westward, Alexander reached Paratonion, where he received an embassy from the Greek colonies of Cyrene. Then, turning sharply south, he led his army straight into the desert. His journey to Siwa soon became the stuff of legend. Most ancient sources agree that the oracle pronounced Alexander the son of Zeus Ammon, and foretold his dominion over the world. His closest companions remained unimpressed, but the proclamation gave Alexander a divine justification for claiming all of Asia, and, it seems, he himself began to believe in his divine lineage. Returning from Siwa, Alexander reorganized the administration of Egypt, dividing authority among numerous satraps, military commanders, and garrison leaders to prevent any single official from becoming too powerful. As pharaoh, he respected the traditional Egyptian system of local governance, while reserving control of the borders and finances for his Greeks and Macedonians. Strong garrisons were stationed at Memphis and Pelusium. The bloodless conquest of Egypt, the recognition of Alexander as the son of Ammon, and the founding of Alexandria firmly cemented Macedonian dominance in the eastern Mediterranean. Standing at the peak of his power and glory, Alexander now prepared to march east into the very heart of the Persian Empire to settle once and for all the question of who would rule Asia. While Alexander was still in Phoenicia, King Darius had sought peace. In his first letter, Darius begged for the release of his captured mother, wife, and children, offering ransom and an alliance. He also reminded Alexander that it was the Macedonians who had first broken the peace, forcing him to defend the lands inherited from his ancestors. The letter struck Alexander as arrogant. Darius referred to himself as the only true king and advised Alexander to be content with ruling Macedonia alone, an insult that infuriated him. According to another version, Darius even offered territories in Asia Minor as ransom, but by now Alexander's ambitions had grown far beyond such concessions, and he concealed the offer from his generals. His reply was harsh. He accused Darius of igniting the war in Greece and mistreating his own people. If Darius wished to reclaim his family, he would have to come to Alexander in person and acknowledge him as his lord. Such demands were unthinkable for the King of Kings, and negotiations stalled. Soon after, however, Darius sent another letter. This time he offered 10,000 talents of silver, along with Asia Minor, Syria, Phoenicia, Palestine, Egypt and the hand of one of his daughters. When Alexander gathered his council, the veteran general Parmenion famously remarked, "If I were Alexander, I would accept," to which Alexander replied, "So would I if I were Parmenion. But I am Alexander." In his response, Alexander declared that he needed neither Darius's gold nor his lands, for all Asia already belonged to him by right, and if he ever chose to marry Darius's daughter, he would do so without the Persian king's permission. Once Darius received this message, he realized diplomacy had failed and began preparing for war. His guess was correct. In the summer of 331 BCE, Alexander's army marched out of Egypt toward Syria. They eventually reached Thapsacus on the Euphrates River, where a Persian force of 6,000 men under the satrap Mazias had been stationed. Hearing of Alexander's approach, Mazias withdrew eastward, ravaging the lands behind him, but he left the crossing unguarded, allowing Alexander to ford the Euphrates with ease. Instead of heading straight for Babylon, Alexander marched north near the foothills, where the climate was more favorable and supplies more plentiful. He also suspected Darius had assembled a great army and might attempt an attack from the rear. His chosen route presented its own challenges, including the crossing of another major river, the Tigris. But again, the crossing was unguarded. When a Persian scouting party approached the Macedonian camp, Alexander had already completed the passage, leading a cavalry detachment. He quickly defeated the Persian riders and learned from prisoners that Darius had gathered a massive army near the village of Gaugamela. Before Alexander could advance, however, he and his soldiers witnessed a lunar eclipse, a terrifying omen in the ancient world. The Egyptian priests accompanying the army calmed the frightened troops, interpreting the eclipse as a sign of Persia's impending destruction. Once discipline was restored, Alexander marched to meet his enemy. In September 331 BCE, the Greco-Macedonian army reached Gaugamela and took position on a hill facing Darius. Having learned from his past mistakes, the Persian king had prepared meticulously. Tapping the vast resources of his empire, he assembled a massive force drawn from dozens of subject peoples and allied tribes. Ancient authors vastly exaggerated the numbers, claiming anywhere from 200,000 to over 1,000,000 soldiers. Realistically, Darius likely fielded around 100,000 infantry and 15,000 cavalry. Alexander's army, by contrast, numbered roughly 40,000 infantry and 8,000 cavalry. To exploit his numerical superiority, Darius chose a broad, open plain where his forces could attempt to encircle the smaller Macedonian army. He even ordered the ground leveled to maximize the effectiveness of his 200-side chariots. Alexander and his commanders knew the risks of fighting the Persians on open terrain. According to some accounts, Parmenion advised a night attack, but Alexander refused, saying he would not steal his victory. He had tactical reasons as well. Fighting in darkness would neutralize his advantage in maneuver, forcing him to rely on luck against a superior force. After preparing his troops, Alexander withdrew to his tent. Despite his outward confidence, he likely felt deep anxiety the coming battle would decide not only the fate of the Near East but possibly his own life. Eventually, he fell into such a deep sleep that he had to be awakened with difficulty on the following morning. Parmenion rebuked him for this apparent carelessness, but Alexander replied that now, with Darius finally accepting battle, he had nothing to fear. As Alexander's forces descended the hill to take their positions, they saw that the Persians had stood in formation all night, weary from fear of a surprise attack. Darius placed his elite troops, the Immortals and Greek mercenaries, in the center. His true strength, however, lay in his cavalry. Riders from the empire's interior, along with his royal guard, stood in the middle. On the left flank he positioned Bactrians and Scythians under Bessus, and on the right flanked the Syrian and Mesopotamian cavalry under Mazias. Ahead stood the 200 chariots ready to open the battle. The vast Persian infantry formed lines behind them. Alexander angled his army slightly to hinder Persian flanking attempts, placing the companion cavalry under his personal command on the right. On the left wing, Parmenion commanded the allied and Thessalian cavalry. Alexander strengthened both flanks with light infantry, with an additional reserve line behind them to absorb any breakthroughs. The Persians stretched their front much wider, but Alexander refused to abandon his favorite tactic, the decisive cavalry strike from the right. He advanced diagonally, pulling the battle line with him. The Bactrian and Scythian horsemen mirrored his movement. Watching closely, Darius eventually ordered them to halt Alexander's maneuver, and a brutal cavalry clash erupted on the Persian left. The heavily armored Scythians proved formidable opponents, and Alexander had to commit his squadrons repeatedly. Meanwhile, Darius launched his side chariots, but by the late 4th century BC, such chariots were outdated. The Macedonian infantry simply opened their ranks, let the chariots pass, and killed the horses and drivers with long spears, while light troops showered them with javelins. A few chariots penetrated the first line, but were quickly neutralized by the reserves, while Alexander's infantry dealt with the chariots. Mazias on the Persian right smashed into Parmenion's forces. Mazias managed to push back the Thessalians, and Indian cavalry units poured through the gap between the phalanx and Parmenion's wing. Instead of attacking the phalanx from the rear, they rode straight toward the Macedonian camp, but were intercepted by Alexander's reserves. Still, Parmenion was under immense pressure and sent urgent pleas for aid. Meanwhile, Alexander's cavalry finally gained the upper hand on the right. Attempting to reinforce his left flank, Darius ordered part of his central cavalry to move in support of the Bactrians. This proved disastrous. Their departure left a gap at the very heart of the Persian line. Alexander immediately struck, leading several companion squadrons. He galloped across the front, rallying the phalanx into a full advance straight toward the center. Toward Darius himself, only the royal guard and a few Greek mercenaries remained near the Persian king as the Macedonian wedge plunged into the thinning ranks. Realizing the danger, Darius did as he had at Issus. He fled, setting off a chain reaction across his army. At the same time, the Persian left collapsed completely, and the companions launched a furious pursuit. It was likely then that Alexander finally received Parmenion's desperate message. A massive cloud of dust obscured the battlefield, and for a long time Mazias was unaware that the Persian center had broken. Once he learned of the rout, his assault lost momentum, and his cavalry soon abandoned the field. By the time Alexander rode to reinforce Parmenion, the danger had already passed. The Thessalians, having endured the worst of the Persian charge, now pressed forward as the enemy fled. The Battle of Gaugamela became Alexander's greatest military triumph. Through bold and unconventional tactics, he had destroyed a far larger army on open ground. The only thing he failed to achieve was capturing Darius himself, though his chariot and weapons were later found in the abandoned Persian camp. Estimates of casualties vary wildly. Ancient sources claim Alexander lost only about 100 men, though more than 1,000 horses, half of them belonging to the companions. Persian losses are exaggerated into the hundreds of thousands, reflecting more the shock of the defeat than reality. Still, the impact was immense. After Gaugamela, the Achaemenid Empire effectively ceased to exist. Darius fled toward Media with his surviving guard and Bactrian allies, hoping to rally distant satrapies for a final struggle. But the Near East now had only one master, Alexander. When the army proclaimed him king of Asia, it merely confirmed what the battle had already made inevitable. Nothing now stood between Alexander and the key centers of the Persian Empire: Babylon, Susa, and ultimately Persepolis, the ancient ceremonial capital. Friends, if you enjoyed this documentary, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss future episodes.